we have texts that become a little embarrassing at some times. In the Bible, for example, God is spoken as having a body, God is spoken as being angry, and a Jewish person called Philo of Alexandria proposed that some of these texts need to be understood in their deeper meaning, and he proposed a theory called allegory, and it was taken up by a Christian theologian called Origen, who used also the same method of allegory, called it typology. But it was basically the same problem. There were problems with the text. It didn't quite open itself up, and hermeneutics was concerned to make this meaning more evident or give it its deeper meaning. Perhaps I could ask Professor D'Souza to complement this if he would like to.
I think hermeneutics as a philosophical discipline really came into its own light in the West in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, with a figure who might be considered to be the father of contemporary hermeneutics, that is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now, Schleiermacher's great insight was to take these three areas of text interpretation, that is scripture, law and literature, these three regions of interpretation, and to make interpretation not a specific or regional discipline but a universal discipline in which understanding is applied in general, whether to these disciplines or any other discipline. That was his great insight, his great contribution. So you can say with Schleiermacher, hermeneutics became an independent philosophical discipline in its own right. In contemporary times, certainly he is could be considered to be the father of contemporary hermeneutics. He paid importance to two aspects. One is called the grammatical and one is the psychological in the construction of texts. Suppose I am reading a text 200 years later. Grammatical means I am looking at the context, the grammar, the form, the structure, the language, the culture, the history, whatever of that time, the external objective factors. Now, why did he pay attention to the psychological, to the personal, private, divinatory, divinely inspired almost? For two reasons. One is because he belonged to a school called Romanticism, which was a reaction to the Enlightenment. Western Enlightenment gave a lot of importance to reason. Romanticism opposed that and gave importance to feeling. So he gave importance to the feeling associated with the construction of a text. Another reason was, suppose we give importance to those external objective structures, it still might be possible for 10 people interpreting an old text to come up with 10 different interpretations. How to judge which is the most important interpretation? So that is why he said the interpreter who not only explains grammatically but also is able to understand the author better than the author understood himself or herself comes up with the best interpretation. That is interesting. In hermeneutics there is a controversy between those people who say we must know the intention of the author, the mind of the author. Other people, that means we must look to the backward of the text, behind. Other people are looking to the forward of the text. Never mind what the author had in his or her mind. Let us see whether this text makes sense for us today. Sometimes we do not know who the author of the text is. So for many reasons, contemporary thinkers tend to pay more importance to the forward of the text. Anyway, Schleiermacher made his contribution. Dilthey was a follower who came a little later, and he made a very famous distinction between explanation and understanding. Explanation, he said, belong to the realm of the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, because they look at reality in a very static, fixed way, and so they can explain because that reality doesn't change, or if it changes according to certain natural laws. Whereas human behavior is unpredictable little bit, or to some quite a large extent. We cannot explain so much but understand. Now he wanted to raise interpretation, especially history. History is an interpretation. Why shouldn't history be like physics? That was his concern. Of course, it is not very easy, and so he was not very successful, but he brought about this distinction between explanation and understanding. And even in the later theorists, there will be that struggle. Should we pay more importance to understanding or should we pay more importance to explanation? Another concept he brought in was Erlebnis or living experience. He was one of those thinkers who said that if you have to understand a text, you have to understand the historical context in which that text has been composed. And that is that is an important contribution. Heidegger, who came later, he gave importance to being, the being of the interpreter. The interpreter lives in time. The interpreter lives in a certain context, in a certain culture, in a certain situation. And most of the time, our consciousness is only at the very, it's like the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. But below that, there is a lot of he will not use a psychological understanding, he will use a philosophical understanding. There is a force structure of understanding. So that we cannot escape from, a force structure of understanding. That gives us a sense of home, our language, culture, etc. So he contributed ontological hermeneutics. Ontos is a Greek word for being. So Schleiermacher was a hermeneut of the text, and he universalized hermeneutics, made it a general discipline. Dilthey gave importance to history. Heidegger gave importance to being, ontos. And the next one is Gadamer, a disciple of Heidegger who died only a few years ago. He gave importance to tradition. So what Heidegger called being or force structure, Gadamer simply said that is our tradition. Now whether we like it or not, we belong to a certain tradition, and that tradition creates certain prejudices in our mind, prejudgments, not understood in a negative way, prejudice. Again, Gadamer is against that enlightenment spirit which says that we must be objective. He says it is not possible to be objective, because one cannot step outside one's own shadow. That shadow is the tradition. So what happens in understanding a text is that the text has its own horizon of meaning. I have my horizon of meaning, and when I read a text, there is a fusion of horizons. When there is that fusion, the confusion goes away. There is no more confusion because there is a fusion of horizons. So all these concepts of tradition, prejudice, fusion of horizons is important for Gadamer. And maybe one of the greatest, the latest, if not the greatest, the latest hermeneutical theorist is Paul Ricoeur. He died also a few years ago. He, in a sense, took the best of all these thinkers. And Gadamer did not like to use method because he was against enlightenment reason. Whereas Ricoeur says, if you want to understand a text, you've got to use method to understand it. Different methods for different texts, depending on the text that one is studying. For Ricoeur, he gave importance to the text. Why? Suppose we had no text of the past, we would not have access to the past. Now we may not have access to the events of the past, but we have access to the meanings of the past. The event disappears. Some events are recorded in those texts. So the text is an attempt to preserve the meaning of the event. Now what happens is, when people are reading it many years, many centuries later, there is a surplus of meaning. I cannot say my interpretation is the best and nobody else can interpret better than me. Why cannot I say this? Because the very next day I myself may come up with a better interpretation. Especially literary texts are very important from that point of view. Ricoeur went back to Schleiermacher's focus on text as the focus of hermeneutics, but he himself soon considered actions to be text, human action. And once you consider not only text but human actions, anything that is understandable of human action to be a text, then you are also saying that all social sciences are structured interpretations. And even in the natural sciences today, many scientists would accept that we come out with rival theories, and the theory that sort of wins the contest goes on as an accepted theory till another better theory comes along. So the theory helps us to interpret the data or the reality. So these are the main thinkers: Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur. These 5 thinkers in contemporary hermeneutics, really each one of them has something very significant to contribute, and each one of them in their own way have enriched this field of hermeneutics.
So basically we are, you would like
I would just like to add one point to what Professor D'Souza has said, and that is something that was very enlightening for me. The realization that history and tradition is not just something that I have. Gadamer said it is something that I am.
Okay.
It is me, so that inevitably when I interpret, it is influencing me. So there is a very deep sense in which I cannot set aside this history because I want to. It has to be perhaps examined and appropriated, made my own, so that it does not become something that hampers rather than allows me to understand things better. So that is something that I find extremely enlightening in the contribution made by Heidegger and Gadamer.
Well, we are talking about the theory of interpretation, and from this kind of discussion that we had now, it emerges that there are a lot of thinkers who have contributed to this theory of interpretation. Now, has it evolved as a full-fledged discipline anywhere in the world? And if so, where do we stand as far as India is concerned?
As Professor Coelho has said, there is a rich tradition, an ancient tradition also of interpretation. We, at least I, have been focusing mostly on philosophy as on hermeneutics as a technical discipline in the Western tradition, and it has been enunciated at least and articulated in a very specialized manner over the past 200 to 250 years. Though, of course, there have been earlier interpretations. Those interpretations, as he pointed out, had to do mainly with religious texts, legal texts, literary texts. But interpretation involving understanding as such, that has come into its own mainly in the last 2 to 250 years, and the thinkers that we have been focusing on are mainly French and German thinkers. Indian interpretation also, of course, is very rich and very strong, but takes especially sacred texts and religious texts into account. Would you agree with?
Yes, I think. My small addition would be that in Heidegger, but more especially in his disciple Gadamer, there would be a tendency to make hermeneutics into a discipline by itself. These people are not so much concerned about interpreting texts or even other realities concerned as texts. Whereas perhaps with people like Ricoeur, there is still a focus on, let us see how we understand texts and what are the conditions for that understanding, and can we arrive at some sort of agreement on these understandings. So there is this little dialectic or play between two tendencies in Western hermeneutics. In India, these are studied, but probably we are still with that clear focus on textual interpretation and a little beyond that.
Well, Professor D'Souza and Professor Ivo, we had a very fruitful and interesting discussion on hermeneutics, which is otherwise what we call theory of interpretation. Definitely this is an important topic, an important chapter in our program of study in philosophy, both in BA philosophy as well as MA philosophy. I am sure this discussion is definitely going to throw a lot of light on the topic and make it more interesting for our students, and we shall definitely look forward to having more such interactions with our students in future. Thank you very much for coming to your studios and sharing your views and really your own thoughtful interventions on various aspects which you described or discussed today. Thank you.